The developments in Crimea, which has been under Russian annexation since 2014, shocked the whole world. Hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens who were resettled in Crimea by order of Putin himself have taken action to return to their countries. With the participation of the local population in the protests that started in the region in a short time, the Russian forces in Crimea received a very heavy blow. Putin, who is extremely afraid of losing Crimea, which is critical for the Ukrainian war, has become unsure of what to do. The independence of Crimea, which has been one of the issues that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has attached the most importance to since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, has come up again with the latest developments. The fact that minority citizens are outnumbered in Crimea, which has been under Russia's unjust annexation since 2014, has greatly disrupted Putin's plans for the region. Putin, who has been trying to implement the assimilation project for Crimea for a long time, tried to convince a large number of Russian citizens residing in Russia to live in Crimea in exchange for certain promises during this process. In addition, Putin forcibly sent the vast majority of the local population in Crimea to other autonomous republics, and at the end of 9 years, the number of Russian citizens in Crimea prevailed over minority citizens. Putin, who thinks that he has finalized his dominance in Crimea thanks to this, has completely backed into a corner in the face of recent events. The effects of the war, which has been going on for more than a year and a half, have now begun to be felt in Russia's border regions as well. The Ukrainian army, which has started to organize cross-border operations thanks to the U.S.-manufactured HIMARS missile systems included in the latest support packages received by Ukraine, has achieved great victories. Thereupon, keeping his promise about the independence of Crimea, Zelensky took action to repel the occupying Russian forces stationed in Crimea from the region. The Ukrainian army, which set foot on the Crimean territory for the first time in many years, captured the town of Perekop, located in the Armyansk Oblast of Crimea, as a result of long-term operations. However, Putin, who carried out most of the shipments of troops, vehicles, weapons, and ammunition to Russian headquarters on Ukrainian territory through Crimea, became mad with anger at this move by the Ukrainian army, and having decided to further increase Russian law enforcement in Crimea, Putin decided to use citizens residing directly in Crimea for this security force. In addition to minority citizens, Russian citizens who were forced to reside in Crimea were also selected for this law enforcement agency. In addition to these developments, which have greatly increased the tension in the region, the appointment of Russian Colonel Vitaly Veselov as the head of the new security force to be established has further complicated everything. Colonel Veselov, who played an active role in the annexation process in 2014, was a name hated by the minority citizens living in Crimea. The fact that these citizens, who were already quite angry about being forcibly recruited into the army, found out that they were going to come under Veselov's command was the last straw that overflowed the glass. The protests in Crimea, where very large riots began in a short time, were also supported by local resistance organizations. The Simferopol region in Crimea, where anti-Putin slogans echoed, became the nightmare of Russian law enforcement agencies as a result of the brawls. Russian law enforcement agencies, which had no chance of intervention in the face of local insurgents, who had been continuing their sabotage activities against the occupying Russian forces in Crimea for a long time, were forced to withdraw from the region. Meanwhile, the long queues formed on the Kerch Bridge, the only land connection of Crimea with Russia, fell like a bomb on the agenda of the whole world, especially Russia. Thousands of Russian citizens who did not want to join Putin's new law enforcement agency left Crimea and headed to the Kerch Bridge to return to Russia. Putin, whose entire assimilation project will end in failure if these Russian citizens leave Crimea, immediately ordered the installation of barricades at the exit points of the bridge. A large number of Russian soldiers stationed at the entrance and exit of the Kerch Bridge did not allow any Russian citizens to leave the area. However, the obstacles put up by Putin were not enough to prevent Russian citizens from leaving Crimea, and Russian citizens who headed to the port of Sevastopol began to return to Russia through their own means. Surprised by what to do in the face of the steps taken by thousands of Russian citizens who left Crimea by renting ships and boats in the port, Russian leader Vladimir Putin decided to deploy all Russian troops in Crimea. Russian soldiers who left their headquarters on Putin's orders tried to suppress the protests that had spread to every region of Crimea, but just at this time, a large number of protesters moved towards the building of the Crimean regional governor's office. Russian soldiers, who wanted to stop the progress of the protesters, set up closing points on all streets. Russian soldiers surrounded the front of the governor's office building and were standing by to prevent the protesters from entering the building. However, the participation of the Crimean Fire Group, one of the largest resistance groups in Crimea, in the protest changed everything. The Fire Group insurgents, who directly supported the protest that was growing bigger by the minute in the city of Simferopol, got into a very big fight with the Russian soldiers. Meanwhile, Russian Colonel Vitaly Veselov, who was assigned to the region by Putin's order, intervened quite harshly against the insurgents with a large number of soldiers under his command. As a result of the long-running brawls, about 270 Russian citizens were arrested. In addition, the developments in Crimea, where nearly 1,000 Russian citizens have been detained, have once again shown how much the crisis has grown. Having turned these rebellions in Crimea into an opportunity, the Ukrainian army has moved to deal the biggest blow to Russian forces in the region. The Ukrainian army, aiming to completely capture the Armyansk region of Crimea, decided to launch a large-scale airstrike on Russian headquarters and Russian ammunition depots located on the Crimean border. TB-2 Bayraktar model unmanned combat aircraft, activated by the order of Ukrainian Chief of General Staff Valery Zaluzhny, began successive airstrikes on the Russian headquarters located in the Crimean town of Kankdek. The Russian soldiers, who were surprised what to do in the face of the unexpected bombardment of the Ukrainian army, created a very big explosion by the shots that hit the ammunition depot as they were fleeing right and left. Tons of weapons and equipment became unusable in the ammunition depot, where there were explosions big enough to be heard from the surrounding areas. Following these developments, which were published in the entire world press in a short time, Putin imposed a publication ban on all news about the incident. Putin, who since the beginning of the war has allowed only reporting of successful operations by the Russian military, has recently turned a blind eye to only propaganda-based publications. The biggest reason for this was the successive defeats of the Russian army in the recent period, so much so that the invading Russian army, which was repulsed from many regions they captured in the first months of the war, has now come to the point of losing Crimea. Despite the efforts of Putin, who completely controlled the media and the judiciary in Russia during his tenure, to hide the facts, the Russian people are now beginning to realize everything. For this reason, in Russia, where access to about 200,000 websites has been blocked, the public is prohibited from accessing objective news. However, in addition to the fact that the war now directly affects Russia's political and financial situation, Ukraine's cross-border operations, especially in Crimea, show that the facts have nothing to do with what Putin is talking about.